So thank you so much. At this point, we'll have several questions in our chat. May we invite Bam to read the first one?
Yes, so the first question from the floor is, what are the current trends in research in LAL?
Oh, well, thanks for the question. So in terms of the current trends, there, as I mentioned, there's a lot of questions being asked about ways that we can characterize or describe processes of LAL development. That's certainly been, you start to see researchers making calls for this direction. Another direction I've seen right now is lots of researchers are finding ways to design a standardized measure or a test to assess someone's language assessment literacy. We can see in Glenn Fulcher's work in 2012, he's designed a questionnaire to actually assess stakeholders' assessment literacy, but that's more through self-reflection, because the items typically ask, do you think this is important? How do you evaluate yourself on X or Y or Z, right? So with this kind of approach, it's really difficult to design a test that can actually measure someone's language ability more objectively without getting into self-reflection. But unfortunately, that just has been the norm so far. Although some scholars have suggested creating some objective tests, like to test someone's knowledge about, say, reliability and validity, but I haven't seen such a test being developed. And in my opinion, honestly, that's actually very difficult to create. But yeah, my personal view is that it might be a fruitful direction to look into how language assessment literacy develops over time, and how assessment literacy might develop as a result of a collaboration, because more and more so we start to see collaborations within local assessment contexts. In the past, you might have just one professor, let's say testing professor, designing the entire test, or one, let's say a program director in language programs who is in charge of designing the entire test. But now, with more and more stakeholders, we start to see bigger teams of test development. And there you can actually have a mix of different expertise, and you can explore how they learn from each other to develop assessment literacy.
All right, thank you so much. Before we move on to the next question, we have Assistant Professor Dr. Chatrapan raising her hand. You may turn on your microphone, Ajan.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I think I didn't do it. Sorry. Okay.
Oh. All right.
I'll take it out. I'll take it out.
All right. Thank you, Ajan. All right. Let's move on to the next. Let's call Jack to read the next question.
All right. For the next question is about the peer evaluation. Okay. Could you please give some recommendations for dealing with the biases in peer evaluation?
Peer assessment has been studied quite a bit, right? Especially in writing context. So it doesn't just start in the field of language testing, but also in second language writing, where we talk about corrective feedback from peers. So we might be able to draw expertise from both areas. In terms of testing, a lot of meta-analysis research that systematically look into empirical studies have shown that peer assessment is not the best format of assessment if you're just focusing on the reliability of the test. However, peer assessment has this additional benefit or pedagogical benefit. That is, you can use this moment as a teaching moment to teach students what's important to learning the language. So to give you an example, and this is similar to Huang's approach as well, that is by conducting peer assessment, you're giving the autonomy and responsibility to students. That is, in a way, you're holding them accountable for these assessments, right? By doing so, students will be pressured to actually study a bit about the criteria. And as we know, if we're talking about speaking assessment or writing assessment, most of the criteria are exactly very important components of the construct we're trying to assess, right? So it's really about what's considered good speech or what's considered good essay. And in order to study these criteria, and the students will be to develop better understanding of best practices in writing, in academic writing, or presentation skills. So to me, that's the most important benefit of peer assessment. Although it's true, I personally would agree that peer assessment is relatively low on reliability when compared with large-scale tests when you hire professional raters. But I'd like to see more of sort of this mix of advantages and disadvantages when it comes to peer assessment, and focus on the positive or the strength of peer assessment in class. Right? Just use it as a teaching moment. And sometimes I don't even call it peer assessment. I just call it sort of like group project or group activity, so that I can place the focus or the emphasis more on teaching and learning rather than just assessment itself, even though they're doing assessment tasks. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's have Bum to ask the next question.
The next question is concerned about the honesty of the student, because right now we use the online testing, online assessment. So the question is, what should be the appropriate test or assessment tasks to minimize the possible problem about honesty of the student, especially the writing class?
That's a very timely question, because I can tell you that's the question we're combating right now in my own context. I manage the English placement test here at University of Illinois, and we also had the same concerns, where in the past we asked students to come to a computer lab and we can proctor the test, right? We can check their IDs, and there's a way we can monitor their test-taking behavior. But with everything moving online, we cannot perform the same level of procedures. So we have to turn to alternative means. And some of the things we can do is to look into, for example, what kind of resources related to technology that is available in your local context, right? So I can provide the solution that we have in our local context. That is, we are currently using ProctorU, which is an online proctoring service, to allow students to take the test overseas or in their own time zone, but they have to use a laptop that has high internet speed and a webcam, so that their test-taking behavior can be monitored and recorded. Right now, the reason why I say you have to look into your local assessment context is that for placement tests in my own context, it's possible to have all students taking tests in this format, but in other contexts, it might not necessarily be the case. I always quote the example of China, for example. Even though with technology, right, not even talking about like cheating or these honesty problems that you mentioned in online testing, China still doesn't have a computer-based college entrance test. And the reason behind it is that you have a lot of test takers coming from rural areas or underdeveloped regions where technology is not always available. So in those cases, you have to think about what's possible, what's practical. When you're considering these practical constraints in your local context, it doesn't mean that you're always going to get the ideal assessment solution. You probably have to lose certain things, but you have to sort of keep a balance between what you want to have versus what's feasible, right? Even though if a test is high stakes, I would say it's probably important to ensure some kind of proctoring service. But if the test is relatively lower in terms of stakes, it might be okay to give students the benefit of doubt, to trust that they will take the test with honesty.
Thank you so much. Let's have the next question, Dam.
So the next question, what are your suggestions for high school language teachers who want to develop their LAL?
So I have a lot to say about high school teachers because at least based on my own experience of research in the Chinese context and versus the context in the US, I've actually seen an interesting difference. That is, high school teachers actually have higher assessment literacy than university level teachers at a group level. I apologize if I am throwing it, bluntly like that. But based on my data, actually, high school teachers tend to have a much higher level of assessment literacy, and here's why. Most of the time, high school English teachers need or required to take licensure exams. So they have to pass certain kind of qualification exams in order to get teaching certificate. And assessment is an important part of it. And when they are taking courses to get these licensure, assessment is also required as well. But at the university context, we see a much wider range. We have certain faculty members, especially those in applied linguistics or language education, with very good expertise and experience in language assessment. But we also have teachers who have not had experience in language teaching or professional training in language teaching or language education. They might hold positions simply because of their research in other areas like literature, translation, but by requirement, they have to teach language classes, right? But it doesn't mean that they actually have the expertise that is required in teaching a class related to assessment or other aspects. So that's why I see the difference there. But in terms of development for high school teachers, my suggestion is that try to reflect more from their assessment, from your own assessment practices. I know high school teachers might be involved in developing school-based assessments, right? Final exam for the school, final exam for your class. And sometimes, depending on the area, you might even be recruited to participate in local examination boards where you develop tests for a mucher group of test users. In those cases, those experiences become quite valuable, and you should trying to seek expertise when you are participating in those projects and see if you can collaborate with your team members. And also if there are professional development opportunities, you should also seek chances to attend talks and seminars related to assessment. But the key, as I mentioned, is to start with assessment experience, right? Usually I think this applies generally to all content subjects. If you're just hearing lectures that talks about theory, it's very difficult for you to remember them for long. But when you have an actual experience, you can easily link your assessment experience to those theoretical concepts. Then your memory will become stronger, and you'll be able to establish a long-term association between your experience in assessment and assessment concepts.
Thank you so much. So that's a very nice advice, especially for high school teachers. Let's have the next question, Jack.
All right. Okay, next question. There's some evidence from previous empirical studies that reveal that institutional or national assessment policy have high-stake assessment system, often hinder teachers to put assessment literacy into practice. What do you think about this situation?
Let me clarify. Are you talking about cases where national policies are not made in such a way that it facilitates the best practice in language testing? And then how do we combat that problem? Is that getting at your question, or am I understanding it correctly?
Or perhaps we may invite the person who asked that question to clarify that.
Yeah, if you can do that, I would really appreciate it.
You may go on and turn on your microphone and clarify your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Yan. Yeah, I just want to ask about the some situation. Let me say in my country, in Indonesia, we have the high-stake assessment system, and then when the teacher probably have their assessment literacy, and then sometimes the policy hinder them to practice it in the classroom.
I see what you mean. I can certainly relate to that, and there are a lot of voices that we hear from educational practitioners regarding how national policies might hinder the best practice in assessment in the classroom. And especially I'm coming from China, I think I cannot be more familiar with this kind of policies where language classes all turn into test preparation courses. And the goal of teaching is really to get students prepared for a college entrance test for the entire high school. So regarding this kind of, or policy that of a similar kind, one thing we can do is, if whenever possible, if you have the potential power to change policy or to negotiate, you should always engage in efforts related to adjustments to educational policies that can have an impact. However, oftentimes we have to be realistic. That means we cannot make changes to policies, right? And yet there are high stakes associated with these policies. In contexts like those, I would say, I would recommend still hold the policies as an important criterion to evaluate your teaching or assessment practice, but trying to see if there is any room for flexibility for you to adjust to still get at some of the best practices in assessment. It may be easily said than done, but to give you an example in the Chinese context, right, we know that China has been a test-dominated society for centuries. And there are lots of complaints coming from students, teachers, families, and even the society about how students are tortured when prepared for the test, for the national test. But we always see examples of language teachers who are trying to make good use of language assessment to promote teaching and learning, right? So a typical example is the formative use of large-scale tests. So an example that I didn't include here in this data set is we interviewed actually a secondary school English teacher in China. And what she's been doing is actually something quite interesting. So, and she knows that there's little flexibility for her in terms of choice of teaching materials, in terms of even syllabus, right? They even have standardized lesson plans that everybody has to follow. So what she did instead is she would actually use those, for example, school-based exams or citywide final exams. She will actually analyze those test items and trying to identify the core constructs or the knowledge that is being tested in those big tests. And then just teach to those constructs, but not through the format of test preparation. But instead, she designed creative ways to still teach those knowledge points, and which does not involve giving students another test. So that's one way. And in addition to that, she also analyzed students' test performances down to the individual item level. And she was able to actually rely on these, say, national or city or provincial tests to identify areas that she needs to improve in terms of teaching. So I think those are perhaps more realistic suggestions I can give, especially I know in a lot of Asian contexts where we have a fairly large population of learners and test takers. And it's not always the case that we can actually change a policy easily. And even in the Western, well, let's say the so-called the West, let's say in the US, there are a lot of national policies these days that sort of govern the use and the development of tests. And if you're familiar with the US context and all the kindergarten to grade 12, we call K-12 contexts, are governed by national standards. And there are testing companies who are designing large-scale tests that are being used by all schools. And then schools have to use this as a measure of student achievement over time. So we see similar kind of cases where teachers are just teaching to the test. So it's not like, you know, what we're having here in Asia is a unique example. So I think everywhere we have the same problem.
Okay, thank you so much for your solutive answers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's return to Bom.
The audience mentioned about Huang approach in the interpretation course, and the approach might work for classroom assessment. However, when it comes to writing items for a standardized test, we might need knowledge on validity, item analysis, statistics, and so on. How to prepare those teachers as item writers to write good items without performing a technical training or statistic involved?
Mm. Um, for teachers to get training in item writing, I would say I have honestly seen very limited opportunities in training, whether it's systematic or not, simply because, let's say, if we're talking about TOEFL and IELTS, because these are proprietary, companies are not willing to give away their secrets in terms of how to write test items, because the test there's test security reasons, right? So that's why, perhaps one of the reasons why item writing, or these, at least item writing skills, are not targeted in a lot of test or assessment training. But what I've recommended to a lot of language teachers is that you can actually design ways to test. You can actually follow this sort of trial and error approach when it comes to item writing. Modeling or mimicking is always the best starting point. So you can actually try to imitate what you've observed from, let's say, TOEFL or IELTS test, and trying to see if you can write items that look similar. And you can actually give it to some sample test takers, like your students. Say if you're tutoring, if you're teaching a test preparation course, or if you're teaching speaking classes that clearly aligns with TOEFL or IELTS test, you can give these tasks to your students and see how they feel about those tasks. If there are differences in how they perceive those tasks, and students' input or test taker input can become an important piece of information to help you, align back to sort of a better way of writing test items. So that's about item writing. About statistical analysis, the best way to combat it is to really bite the bullet and learn how to do it. You don't have to learn the complicated measurement models. As you know, in psychometrics, they do like a wide range of analyses. But for language teachers, all you need is some simple item statistics, like item difficulty and item discrimination. I think you can easily find videos of introducing how to calculate item difficulty and how to calculate discrimination through these YouTube videos. And those are always good resources that I refer to. And so I would recommend those channels. And then oftentimes they will also teach you how to use softwares to do that as well. So the key, I'm sorry, I guess the key is not to avoid all these problems, right? It's find a way that you can do your best to still understand these concepts with your own resources and expertise.
All right, thank you so much. I know that we're actually already consumed the time allotted, but we have three interesting questions. Would you like to answer them?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, sure. So
ask away.
Let me ask the first question. Language testing for study abroad and international employment is still problematic. Any comments on international tests that subscribe to competence over performance in English language?
Well, that's sort of the million-dollar question, right? that we have in the language testing world. One of the reason why people still have debates over what's considered the best tests or the best tasks to use is that we don't have a unified or a consensus over how we define language ability, right? We know in the past we've come such a long way from defining language in terms of the structuralist approach, right? Looking at how first language differs from second language, to looking at sort of the competence-based model, then later on talking about communicative competence, then just focusing on performance. So there's a wide range. And so far, as a practitioner, I would want to say that trying to actually use tasks, or it's always best practice to use tests that are reliable and valid, even though it might not seem to be the most authentic, but at least when a test has reliability and validity, you are more certain about what the scores mean. But as the researcher identity inside me will tell, will say something like this, that is, all methods succeed and all methods fail. Even though there are a lot of testing methods that might seem really out-fashioned these days, but there has never been very strong evidence that suggests those methods do not work at all when measuring language proficiency. An example I can give you is that, for example, close testing has been fallen out of favor in many contexts, right? It was a very big a hit in language testing where at one point scholars are proposing that this is it. All you need is a close test. But today we know that's a little bit too much. And we know that close tests cannot measure everything that we have. But it still remains to be a fairly reliable testing instrument. And that's the reason why a lot of researchers in, for example, in experimental linguistics or second language acquisition still use this method because it's reliable, it's quick and efficient, right? So if you want to have a little bit of a researcher or so-called or sort of a testing expert mindset, we should hold all the testing methods equal. Try to forget about the idea of trend and just think about what methods work in your own context, what methods do not work. I think that's probably the best. I know I'm not directly answering this question, but I think it relates to this question in the sense that we all have our strong perceptions about how a test should look like, especially when such tests have very high stakes.
Right. Thank you so much. So we have this quite interesting, as it is very much relevant in the current situation. What do you think are the best ways to assess a learner's current listening and speaking ability now that we are using only online platforms?
That's difficult because I haven't had enough time to think about it, not just at this talk, but since the pandemic hits, it's only been a few months. To assess listening and speaking ability, and clearly we see when people interact online, let's say through Zoom chats, there are all different ways that we can use or different strategies we can use to maintain a conversation. So to assess listening and speaking ability through online platforms, one thing we need to be realistic is that we are unlikely to get the level of authenticity as we would have in face-to-face interaction, like in a one-on-one interview, right? So if your goal is to achieve authenticity, I would say perhaps you won't be able to achieve much, and you probably will be disappointed at what you can have with online testing platform. However, the online testing platform can actually allow you to focus on a lot of other things. For example, because of the ease of delivery, you might be able to put more testing items on your platform, and you might be able to actually try different creative assessment formats, right, to test someone's speaking and listening ability. If it's one-on-one interview, probably it's difficult to embed a lot of listening materials, right? Because most of the time the listening input comes from the interviewer. But if it's online platform, you can use a lot of video clips like movies, radio casts, podcasts. There's a range of different formats you can actually use. And actually the internet or the cyber world opens up all sorts of resources you can actually adapt into testing materials. So I think that's actually good news. The best way is trying to think about what's the most common way of interaction when people go online, and trying to design some tasks that trying to simulate that procedure. But at the same time, still design scoring criteria that allows you to get at some of the key concepts with speaking, for example, like fluency, pronunciation, lexical grammar, or with listening, when you have different movies and radio casts, and try to focus on how, for example, the speed of speech or different kind of linguistic characteristics you can manipulate with those authentic materials. And by doing that, you will be able to assess listening abilities in a much more authentic way.
All right, thank you so much. This last question is quite interesting as it affects several stakeholders, especially that the current situation is not allowing us to, accommodate people physically in universities. So the question is that given that other countries still push through with high stakes assessment, such as entrance tests or examinations, how can the schools, or what can the schools do with regard to the assessment to balance teachers' assessment practices in the synchronous or asynchronous learning and preparations for college entrance exams?
When instruction and assessment and learning is disrupted by an unexpected event, a lot of the efforts that we put into our original assessment format might not work. Right. And we will be faced with a lot of uncertainties because everything becomes new. In a case like this, my recommendation is always try multiple ways to measure. And it's actually one of the key principles in the measurement is that you can never rely on just one test. You should always have multiple tests available. So in the context of a pandemic, when everything is changing, the delivery of instruction, the context of learning, the conditions of learning, the time of learning, then you have to think about all possible ways that you can convert to, trying to use all possible opportunities to convert your pedagogical practices into an assessment practice, to triangulate different kind of information you can get from different assessment methods to get a more unbiased assessment of your students' language learning outcome.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you so much for generously answering those follow-up questions. And if I would put this entire session, I would take the 3 C's from the 4 C's of the 21st century, where in order for us to address the changing landscape of education, we have to be creative in finding solutions to bridge language testing, assessment, and learning. We need to communicate, as we have to have a clear understanding on how we can address these ongoing problems. And perhaps the main key is collaboration. It's more of understanding what are the strengths of your colleague and trying to work together so that we could address all the gaps and perhaps fill in the gaps. So even though we are in a disruptive educational landscape, we can still push through with our learning and teaching. So thank you so much once again for this very insightful talk in language assessment literacy. And I would think that everyone would agree that everyone learned a lot from this session. Thank you once again, Assistant Professor Dr. Shunyan.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
For our next webinar session is going to be graced by none other than Professor Emeritus Stephen Krashen, who will talk about self-selected fiction, the path to academic success, which is happening on the 3rd of July, happening 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Thailand time zone. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar series.
So I would like to add some information about this session. Good news for everyone that we got more seats for Stephen Krashen, and I will announce later to open the enrollment or the registration. All right. So please tell your friends that to be ready. Thank you. And thank you, Shun. It's very insightful information. I enjoyed a lot. Thank you.
All right. That concludes our session on today's talk. Thank you once again, and see you all in our next webinar session.
Thank you, everyone.